I'm here with Juliet and Rose, who are the directors of a production of Iphigenia and Aulis, which is going to be on here in St Andrews at the Baron Theatre later this week, although you'll be watching this after the production, I think. And I've just been talking to Rose and Juliet and the rest of the cast for a little bit, and we're just going to have a conversation about the production for a few minutes. The first thing I wanted to ask you both is Euripides, Iphigenia and Aulis. Perhaps Juliet, you could just tell us briefly what the play is about, just very briefly, or what the key plot points, if you like.
So the play begins with Agamemnon admitting that he tells the story of Helen and the fact that Helen has now been taken away by Paris, and that all of Greece and all of her sort of ex-suitors have got together to fight to get her back. And then he says that as the ships are failing to sail, the wind is bad and they're failing to sail to Troy, they need good breezes essentially. So they ask this prophet Calchas what they need to do, and he says that Agamemnon needs to sacrifice his own daughter to the goddess Artemis, and she will grant them favourable winds. So that's how the play begins, and he decides that he can't go through with it. So he gives his old servant a letter saying that they shouldn't go through with it, which his brother Menelaus intercepts, who is Helen's husband, and he angrily confronts Agamemnon and essentially persuades Agamemnon to go through with it, and send this letter pretending that Iphigenia is going to get married to Achilles to lure them there, and then I'll actually sacrifice her. Anyway, Clytemnestra and Iphigenia turn up, and they still think that she's going to get married to Achilles, which would be a really great honour because Achilles was a very famous warrior. And this continues for some time until Clytemnestra actually encounters Achilles himself, who tells her that he is not engaged to her daughter and something has been going on. And then the old servant comes in and tells Clytemnestra the truth about the fact that her daughter is going to be sacrificed, and they decide to try and make a plan with Achilles. Anyway, this ultimately ends in a confrontation between Clytemnestra and Agamemnon about the fact that he is disrespecting her and doing a horrible thing by sacrificing their own daughter. And so, but he explains that he can't not do it because all of the Greeks are there and they're all waiting for him to do it, and he has to do it for his country. In the meantime, Iphigenia herself has sort of become persuaded and ultimately says that she will do it for Greece and that it's a great honour to be this symbol for Greece. And that's how our version of the play ends. With
Iphigenia walking off to be sacrificed so that the Greek fleet can get to Troy to fight the Trojans for Helen. And so we have a story where a father has initially been prepared to deceive his own wife and daughter to lure her to Troy. Has second thoughts. To Aulis. Has second thoughts, but then is prevented from actually revealing his own ruse, as it were, going back on his word by Menelaus and the rest of the army. So it's a tale of kind of second thoughts, thwarted, of initial deception and betrayal within the family, and of course it's also, in a way, although it was written many years after Aeschylus's Oresteia, which tells the story of Clytemnestra killing Agamemnon in revenge for the sacrifice of Iphigenia, in many ways it plays like a sort of prequel to Aeschylus's Oresteia, doesn't it? There's a sense in which Euripides is exploring that kind of period which gets described in the Oresteia, but which isn't actually staged, and of course the circumstances are very different. So, I mean, Iphigenia and Aulis is a play that's not as well known as, say, Euripides' Medea or Sophocles' Antigone. Why did you both decide to pick this play? Rose, maybe you could start.
I think it actually sort of appealed to us that it's not a play that people are sort of likely to go into knowing as well as that they would know Medea or Oedipus. I think that gave us as like directors like a good like amount of freedom to sort of try and really make our own story rather than a show that necessarily like people will be going in as an audience like expecting to see. And also I think there's like a certain image of kind of Greek theatre as like it's really old and therefore it exists in the past, it's not relevant to the modern day. And this felt like a play where actually there's sort of a huge amount of modern resonance now. You know, there's always wars going on. They might not be happening here, they might not be happening to us, but they are always going on. You know, the devastating impact of war is always present in the world. And I think it looked like to us a really good play where we could actually show an audience who maybe, you know, didn't study classics and didn't necessarily know like the more obscure Greek tragedies, just how relevant and just sort of what sort of modern resonance it could have in today's world.
Yes, I suppose one of the questions the play poses is how far should we be prepared to go to fight for a cause that we think is just? Or, I mean, at various points in Euripides' plays, we have characters partly justifying the Trojan War on the grounds of civilization. You know, that Greece is this great civilized world, and there's an implication that these are the people that kind of invent the polis and invent so much of what gets regarded as great culture and political forms of organisation and so on and so forth. And the Trojans are barbarians from a Greek point of view. And yet in this play we have Agamemnon initially being prepared to kill his own daughter, his own kith and kin, in order to serve that cause. And then of course the question is, well, is that civilized by anyone's values? Is that civilized? So I think you're right that it's a play that really got its original audience and now modern audiences to think very carefully about why do we fight wars, and when we claim certain values in support of an idea of a just war, a war that's a good war because injustices have been done to us, or we're fighting for perceived freedoms or whatever, then what kinds of savagery and violence are we prepared to do, and to whom, in order to carry that out, and do those acts of violence justify the ends? So I think you're both on the nail there with this being a play that speaks to those questions. There's also a sense, isn't there, that I think when we were talking before, you're interested also in the way this play highlights the effects of war on women. Of course, you know, in ancient Greece, it's the men who do the fighting, and yet there's a sense in which in Greek tragedy there are many female characters and female choruses who are affected. So I wonder if you could perhaps talk a little bit about how this particular play and your version of it brings out those concerns.
Yeah, so I think, like particularly sort of in the UK, I think when we look at war, we now actually have a sort of like a fairly even-handed look towards it, in that women can be part of the army and women can fight. But in like a lot of countries, like the effect of war on female members of the family who maybe don't fight themselves but have fathers and brothers and husbands or sons who fight is immense, and not one that's necessarily looked at, because these are often, like Iphigenia is sort of, we've pictured as about like a 16-year-old girl, you know, like she's incredibly vulnerable. Like she's sort of almost entirely subject to what her father wants her to do. And similarly, Clytemnestra, you know, we obviously see when we get to the Oresteia, like the true effects that the events of this play have had on her. But they're sort of these characters that really don't have very much control at this point in time. They're very much ruled by the men and the men's desire to go to war. And I think that that's something that, again, is really clear, you know, the effects of war on women who don't necessarily have control or complete equality or freedom to make their own choices or to make choices outside of their family is massive, and one that we don't necessarily think about. So like that was part of our inspiration for like giving the proceeds of the show to charity, to Women for Women, as a sort of a way of demonstrating that, like, you know, by putting this play on, we want to actively make a difference towards something, rather than just it being something that like we're telling the audience and then we're going home. We're actively trying to like raise awareness for this and actually make a difference with the production.
Tell me a little bit about the charity that you've chosen. This is a charity that helps women in war-torn areas or refugees.
So mostly it helps women in post-conflict zones kind of put their lives back together, essentially, and it recognises that that it is women that are mostly going to be the victims of mostly men's choices, I'd say.
Right, yeah.
And that also these women also need to bring up their children in these and educate them or find money or shelter, and it kind of works all around the world to where war has happened rather than is happening, to make sure that these women can get them and their families' lives back on track. And it also like recognises that the women are the centre of the house in that way, in that they are responsible for all their family getting fed, getting shelter, and their well-being. So that's what.
That sounds. That sounds like an important cause, and it is, I think, a very suitable play for that, precisely because of this figure of Iphigenia. I mean, Iphigenia is an interesting character because when she finds out that she's being brought to Aulis on false pretenses, and Achilles doesn't know anything about this supposed marriage, and then she learns that actually she's to be sacrificed in the course of war. Initially, she's appalled and she doesn't want it to happen, just as Clytemnestra, her mother, doesn't want it to happen. She doesn't want to be killed. But then she is persuaded, and a lot of classical scholars who work on this play have various difficulties with that, or often the play has been seen as a less successful play because her turnaround, her sudden change of mind, has been seen to be implausible, a kind of problem of characterization. How have you dealt with that? I mean, you've hinted at it a bit already, because you've talked about the fact that you're stressing that in a sense she's a teenager, really. She's vulnerable to influences. But perhaps you could talk a bit more about that.
Well, not only does she change her mind extremely quickly, but Menelaus and Agamemnon both have really changed their mind really quickly about what they want. And Agamemnon changes his mind about 3 times. And then Menelaus changes his mind. And I think that kind of shows that, firstly, those 2 men are able to change their minds about regarding other people's lives, and they're just, what they're feeling in that moment is going to affect her life. Her changing her mind kind of, I think, just shows the fact that she's, I think, giving in to the inevitable. And also she realises that it's so interesting, because you'd say that Agamemnon's the main character of the play and he's the tragic hero, but the only heroic character in this play is Iphigenia, and she recognises that, and no one else has. Even, like, really interestingly, Achilles says to her, "It's a terrible thing to die," which, if you know kind of the context of who Achilles is and the fact that he decides to choose to die young for glory, that's so interesting that this Achilles is that in comparison to one of the greatest heroes, that she is made to look even more heroic. So I think the fact that she changes her mind is that I think she partially does it for her father, because she sympathises with him, and she, I don't know, it is so weird, but we've kind of done it as an emotional thing where she picks up her father's jacket and realises what her father will go through if she doesn't do that. We've shown that they have a really good relationship, unlike her and her mother, perhaps, who are a bit more distant, and so she would sort of do anything for him. And also the fact that she recognises that she will die. She will do something that will be remembered.
So there's a sense in which she's coming round to the idea of the fact that if you fight for it will be her way of fighting for a cause.
Yeah.
And that it will give her the sort of fame that a male hero might have.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the ways in which young people are influenced into fighting for causes in modern day contexts, in all sorts of cultural settings. And the way that this play can be made to speak to that vulnerability, really, of how all kids want to sort of make their parents proud in some way or another, and if those parents are telling them that a certain thing is the noble thing to do or the right thing to do, then it can lead to quite extreme behaviours, or indeed it may not be a family member, it may be another source of undue influence. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. But I really like the way that you've drawn, from the sound of it, the way you've drawn out these themes. There's so much to talk about. I talked with you all before, but we can't talk about everything. I mean, I've been grilling you two a bit. I mean, are there any questions about the play that you've got for me? It's probably a bit late to actually help you with production now, given it's going to be on tomorrow. But is there anything about the play that you want to raise with me, or you think that you'd be curious about as you've gone through? I mean, I might not know the answer, to be honest, because I don't know all the ins and outs of this particular play. But
do scholars ever comment on how different this version of Achilles is?
Yes, I think they do, and the kind of figure of Achilles in tragedy is an interesting one, because there are other tragedies that don't survive anymore that revolved around Achilles, and I think there's a sense in which if we had more of those, this Achilles might seem a little bit more understandable. That it's clear that tragedy is interested in the sort of pre-Iliadic life of Achilles, and it's just an accident of survival. But we don't have much of that. But what sorts of things stand out to you? Just the fact that he's quite, in a sense, he's quite a moral figure, isn't he?
Yeah, I think there was definitely like surprise when we sort of first started looking at those scenes, that sort of after he'd found out that like this marriage wasn't happening, that like he was still sort of so desperate to save Iphigenia, and part of that, like you do see, sort of comes from his concern with like his honour and like what offence it might do to him. But even after that, then like offering to marry her, like if she changes her mind, that sort of aspect of him almost seeming to like fall in love with her seemed like quite uncharacteristic of like the sort of the Achilles that I guess we know from the Iliad.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
Like, it's a much more emotional, a softer emotional, rather than sort of constant anger.
It's interesting, isn't it? I suppose that because the Iliad is about his anger, that's how the whole Iliad starts. Our view of Achilles is very much coloured by that particular representation. But of course, in antiquity, there is the sort of other image of Achilles, Achilles as lover. Achilles, in one version, Achilles actually hides, he disguises himself as a woman and lives among women in order to try and avoid going to Troy.
Yeah.
There is this other side to Achilles that's there in the Greek myths and in the stories. And I think another great thing about you picking this play is precisely because it sort of brings out the fact that Greek myth contains, as it were, other masculinities or other aspects of masculinity. And of course, even in the Achilles of the Iliad, we see an Achilles who is very angry, but also an Achilles who actually shows some tenderness towards Briseis, and this is controversial because, of course, ultimately she's a victim of war. I mean, she's been taken by force by the enemy, so we have to be careful about this. And also, of course, his great grief and pain over the loss of Patroclus, that terrible sense of grief and guilt and strong emotion that he feels for Patroclus. So I think, in a sense, it's there in the Iliad, but because it's not directed towards, as it were, an object of sexual affection, well, apart from Briseis, of course. I mean, he does say that he loves Briseis like a wife, kind of thing. He feels something for Briseis. So it's there in the Iliad, but it's sort of it gets smothered or kind of talked out a bit by all the kind of anger and the sort of military berserking that he does. So yeah, I guess that you can. I guess that what my feeling is that the more you look into Achilles, the more you get this more rounded picture of a character who feels strongly, but feels the full range of emotions.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Another thing I find interesting in Iphigenia and Aulis, Achilles says he will help her if it needs to be, but you can tell that he's reluctant.
Yeah.
And he's also like Agamemnon, scared of the rest of the army, and that he'll fight them. He doesn't really want to.
Yeah. And he doesn't think he'll win.
Yeah.
Which is
unusual.
a
complete contradiction to the Iliad's Achilles, who goes against the entire army and lets them all down.
Yeah. And
knowing that he can overpower them all, essentially.
Yeah. And when he goes into fights, you don't get the sense that he's worried about the opponent. You sort of always get a sense that he really believes in his own strength. He knows that he'll be fated to die, but he believes that sort of at any other moment he can win any given fight. The fact that he sort of expresses like a kind of worry about like all the sort of other army members gathered are going to fight against me.
Right. Yes.
Sort of like a slightly unusual lack of confidence almost.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose in a way Euripides is a bit. This is a bit Euripidean, where Euripidean sometimes likes to sort of test the Homeric image a bit and say, well, what if he was? What if this isn't quite true, or what if this isn't the whole story? Or who was it? Of course, remember as well, the Iliad is the Iliad is after 9 years of fighting. Yeah. So Euripides is maybe saying, well, was Achilles always this confident? Or did he actually, how did he gain this confidence? Well, maybe he didn't, maybe he gained it through 9 years of hard slog and fighting all around Troy. Was he like this in Aulis? Well, he hadn't necessarily done as much fighting when he was in Aulis. So there's people talk about realism in connection with Euripides, and they talk about him as someone who self-consciously questions tradition, but you could sort of put the two together there, because he's giving you a different picture to Homer, but he's also saying, okay, let's go back 9-10 years and think about what Achilles would be like then. Well, he wouldn't be the Achilles we see after 9 years of fighting at Troy. So in a sense, there's a sort of characterological logic. Sorry, that's a lot of logic to it. And also, I think the thing about the sort of political situation with the army, I think it is there in the tradition that the kind of the army are restless. The Laos they're difficult to control, and if everybody's already got there and there's this mission and there's plunder to be had, then people aren't there unless they're looking for something. They're looking to actually kind of gain from this invasion. And there's a lot at stake, basically. So his fear of the army, again, is a sort of plausible thing, given where we are in the story, I think. But you're right as well, that it does again give us this sort of different image, which is, I think, entertaining for an audience, because it gives them a sort of clever take on Homeric, the Homeric kind of traditional view, by saying, well, doing that sort of what if, it's a bit like that thing you get with fan fiction, or you get with prequels, in in modern cinema franchises. It's like, that what if origin stories and so on and so forth. So
I think the other thing I found interesting in the play is Agamemnon and Menelaus' relationship, because they only really have like that one scene together where Menelaus confronts him over the letter, but it's quite an odd scene because there's a few moments where they seem like really antagonistic. There's sort of like vying for like power and dominance. But then at the same time, like Menelaus sees Agamemnon's like kind of grief when he has like a speech about like how terrible it is that he's going to have to kill his daughter, and he sort of really softens towards him, and he changes his mind, and there's suddenly this stuff about how like I couldn't let down a brother, like I see what this means to you, and I thought that was like a really, given that we only really see them in like that one scene, like together, I thought that was like a really odd kind of like present. Like we were trying to work out like things like sort of like which one is older, like which one do we think is sort of like which one do we think was like their father's favourite, which one like do we think is sort of like more intelligent and things like that. Like they've got a really sort of odd, like simultaneously really combative, but also like brotherly relationship.
There is a sense of them being brothers, yeah. It's a good question about which one's older. I don't know.
We couldn't find out.
I'll go and I should go away and look that up, because it's a really good question actually as to what are seen to be their relative ages. It's tricky.
That does have like a sort of influence on like how you would like view relationships quite often, like an older sibling.
Yes, exactly.
Because obviously, sort of within their family history, there have been like issues with brothers, like in the set of brothers before them. So it kind of it makes sense if you're kind of like tracing the myth from like Tantalus down. But it was like, because you only get like this one really short burst of their relationship. It was like a really like a lot like was packed into like one scene of how a really complex dynamic between the two of them.
They kind of, when they were adults, sort of met to complete different places and like ring each other up at Christmas.
But also would go to war for each other. It's a really odd.
But they have to, because they made that oath. But it's just so interesting that Agamemnon now has to give up so much for Menelaus, and you think that there's really nothing that in that relationship.
And I suppose again an audience is going to be thinking about what happens next. I mean, the play you've picked is all about the audience thinking about what happens next, because of course Clytemnestra makes it quite clear what she's going to she hints strongly about what's going to happen to Agamemnon. Now she knows that Iphigenia is going to be sacrificed. Achilles, we've talked about what happened next with him. Menelaus and Agamemnon, we know from the Oresteia and from the Odyssey that Menelaus is ultimately Menelaus is going to end up back home in Sparta with his wife, living it up and boozing, and everything's going to be hunky-dory again, more or less. And so this sense that here's one brother, there's a strained relationship, there's a sense in which, is it really, Agamemnon's job or the Greek world's job to get this woman back or not? And then there's also this sense that Agamemnon is going to kind of, in a sense, he may gain honour and reputation and booty from sacking Troy, but ultimately he will lose everything. And Helen and Menelaus will lose nothing in the long term. So I think some of the kind of weirdness is about that payoff, I think. It's about playing off plausibility, a certain plausibility and a realism of tension against the sort of end point where, there are lots of different sacrifices that Agamemnon makes. It's not just his own daughter that he's sacrificing at this moment, this point of decision. And it's all about decisions as well, this play, because he decides to send the letter, then he decides that's a terrible idea, but it gets intercepted, and then he decides to give in to the pressure. But there's also a question about, when is it ever just your decision? That's the other fascinating thing about this play. And there's two dynamics. There's the ways in which family bonds make us feel like we have to do something, and we don't feel like it's our own decision. And then there's also bigger institutional pressures when we're the head of an army, or there's this sense of the whole kind of destiny of Greece is somehow suddenly pushing us towards an invasion. You know, you hear these apocryphal stories about Blair. I remember once someone told me that, I don't know if it's true, but, you know, Blair ended up in kind of colloquy with, I can't remember who it was, a priest or the Archbishop of Canterbury or somebody, where Blair said, and, you know, who knows how true this is or how honest he was being, where he felt like he had somehow was being propelled into invading Iraq, that he couldn't go back now even if he wanted to. Now, that maybe, you know, we probably won't be able to have this on the video, but, you know, it may be that that's not true. But I remember someone telling me this, that a friend of a friend knew this or claimed this, and there's something plausible about it. Yeah. This idea that you know, your position in a family or as a leader gets you on this path where, in one sense, you're calling the shots, but in another sense, you don't feel fully in control. Mm-hmm. So there's the gender level of not in control, which is clearly there, but in a sense, you know, in some ways, some of this play is about how even the men don't always feel in control. So it's fascinating. We should wrap it up, but I think that's gone very well. I don't know whether maybe edited it, maybe not, but if it's not, I'm going to thank Juliet and Rose, not just for taking time out of their busy and now towards the end process rehearsal schedule. I'm sure it's going to go well, so it's going to be fine. But also for agreeing to talk to us and for doing this play, because you're doing a great thing for St Andrew's Classics and the Drama Centre and for the students and whoever wants to come. And it's also nice that a little bit of money will go towards this good cause that you've chosen as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you.